Good morning. In 2014, New York City will have a new mayor for the first time in 12 years. Our city's new leadership must ensure that New York remains a globally competitive and livable city with sustainable design and infrastructure investment to rival any other metropolitan area in the world, with well-balanced, thoughtful development with a diversity of jobs, housing, and opportunities for all New Yorkers from all neighborhoods. We must work to encourage an economy that draws talent and fosters many different industries. We must support our unique cultural institutions and arts offerings. We must be prepared as well to face and adapt to whatever the next environmental challenges may be. We must continue to thrive as a livable, equitable, resilient city. This is an exciting time for New York and for all New Yorkers. According to the 2013 MAS survey on livability, 76% of New Yorkers feel optimistic about a new administration. It's an opportunity to take a fresh look at the issues that shape our city's future, to develop new strategies to confront our city's challenges. I want to welcome our moderator for this discussion, a friend to the summit, to MAS, and to our cities, Vice President of Community and National Initiatives at the Knight Foundation, Carol Coletta. And our panel, Greg Clark, Betsy Gotbaum, Alicia Glen, and Edwin Torres.
Thanks, Sophia. It's the day after the mayoral election. You wake up your mayor. So what are the top 3 priorities for the future of the city you've just been elected to lead? Greg, I'll start with you.
As I'm ineligible to stand for mayor, as I'm not a US citizen, I think
you can say anything without fear.
Let me tell you what to me is most obvious looking at this city from outside. As I said yesterday, most of the things that can be done within the boundary of New York City are being pretty well done by New York City government, give or take the quibbles that everyone in the room will have. All of the big problems facing New York City have a geography which is bigger than the city itself. A geography of at least a region, if not a geography that goes across a wider area. New York City, I understand that in the US, local government, state government is sacrosanct. But at the moment, your mosaic of governmental entities is preventing you from solving the big challenges you have. So my first deed as the new mayor of New York will be to create a regional government.
So you will resign immediately and opt out. Okay, we're waiting on that. Betsy?
Well, I have to disagree with what you said because, first of all, the mayor doesn't have the authority to create a regional.
Don't quibble with the details.
Oh, I'm sorry. But I do agree that probably one of the great problems in the city today is the lack of coordination between agencies, between what's going on in development and non-development, and the whole area of, for example, last night I happened to be at 20th Street and 11th Avenue and looked down on the Hudson Yards development and the number 7 train extension, and I looked and I thought, I wonder where the schools are. Has anybody really thought carefully about the residential buildings that will be here, and there are going to be many, but are there schools, and are they well integrated into where those residential buildings are as opposed to the commercial buildings? Which, again, the commercial buildings, why are we building so many commercial buildings in New York City? Isn't there a glut on commercial office space right now? I know we're looking to the future, but then that leads me to think about the redevelopment of the area around Grand Central Station. Is that something we are really carefully looking at? So while I think some of the efforts of the last 12 years have been very, very good, I do think we have to rethink a lot of them. And I know
so hang on a minute, Beth.
Yeah.
You're thinking, but you're mayor.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do?
What am I going to do?
Yeah, what are you going to do? What's your top priority?
I'm probably going to listen to the International Architects Association and appoint a deputy mayor for design and planning, and a deputy mayor that has real power, that can coordinate all these efforts, that has the experience and the knowledge and the connections to do that.
Alicia?
Well, I mean, I think variations of all of these themes. I think that I think it's really important to understand that one of the challenges is to continue to invest in the city and continue to see how important the role of public sector investment in a comprehensive development agenda is, and to recognize, to Betsy's point and to your point, that there are multiple agencies that have jurisdiction over all sorts of investment in, whether it's school construction, whether it's looking at the housing agenda from the various housing agencies, or whether it's what EDC is doing. And I think that it would be incredibly important and ultimately drive much better impacts, both for communities and for the way in which the city leverages private sector capital and works with the private sector to have a more traditional, in many cities you have a redevelopment authority or a centralized place where there's one-stop shopping for really advancing this more comprehensive development agenda, so that you're not just thinking about, well, how are we going to finance, 15,000 units of affordable housing over the next 2 years? How are we doing that in conjunction with also our objectives around creating retail, creating arts facilities, financing schools, and having all of the tools in the toolbox available, which are, of course, multiply jurisdictional and layered across, federal, state, and local. But if you have a professional staff who has ability to work across those tools and really direct the limited resources the city will have in a much more thoughtful and comprehensive way, and then be able to leverage that public sector investment with a very willing and able and creative private sector community that has to be part of this picture. So I really think that we can consolidate our efforts, and that will ultimately lead to better results for communities, but also you will leverage much more private capital and get much more buy-in from the development community if people are not forum shopping and feel frustrated by, I want to go do Seward Park, right, which we're working on right now, and it's got multiple types of institutions in it, and you're going to have to go to 18 different agencies to finance that, and that's nuts. And that's really doing a disservice to all of the talent we have here.
So it's very interesting. Each one of you has referenced coordination and the need for it, whether it's on a regional level, whether it's on a local level, spanning public-private, one place, even coordination. Betsy, you mentioned. Eddie, do you have a different response, a different priority?
It's slightly similar. It's actually about coordination between the private and public sector. I mean, thanks to the MAS Summit on survey on livability in New York City, which we were able to support, we're really seeing the anxiety out there about the jobs crisis. And it seems to me that the private sector really needs to be very actively engaged in this issue. So much of the response to the jobs crisis has been very supply-side focused. But ultimately, without robust engagement of the private sector, you're not going to really be able to create more jobs. You really need to engage them very heavily in terms of what roles and what skills are needed to inform workforce development, and also to be able to engage them in the issue of investing in workforce development.
You mentioned the survey, and I was looking at the survey results. What's interesting to me is how satisfied New Yorkers are with New York, the quality of life. Let me ask you, in light of that, what do you think the thorniest problem is that the new mayor will face?
Well, I think there's a couple. One of them is, while there is a high level of satisfaction, that's hardly income neutral. One you have is NYCHA, which is, our city housing authority, which is, if it was its own city, would be the 11th largest city in the nation, So there's great work being done out there in Brownsville around the collective impact approach to making sure that our most vulnerable residents aren't evicted, and around homelessness prevention. There's the issue of infill housing, which is certainly not politically neutral, but something needs to be done, one, to diversify the income, to create more income streams into NYCHA, but also to address the issue of food deserts and the need for social services there. And then finally, there's the issue of the amount of jobs that are being created in the outer boroughs that are being filled by people who live in the outer boroughs. And there's simply the issue of bus rapid transit and greater borough-to-borough access. And that can only be done through buses. We're not going to be able to redo the subways in those regards.
Right. Other thoughts?
Well, I would pick up a little bit on what you said. Clearly the satisfaction is correlated to people who have really been able to ride this wave, and that's a great thing. But I think to not understand that fundamentally the income gap has grown. The poverty statistics are appalling. I think close to 20% of New Yorkers live below the poverty line. And so, if you're the next mayor, you have to begin to think of ways in which you can use the unbelievable economic power of the city. And I do think that we're not gonna, it's not, sky's not falling because Bloomberg is not mayor anymore. I mean, the city will continue to have its fundamental strength as a global financial center, as a global communications and arts and tech center. And the question really is, how do you begin to devise mechanisms where you can capture, and not in a, oh my God, Sandinista kind of way, but how can we capture this incredible wealth that the city is continuing to generate and use government in an appropriate way to begin to address some of these other issues in a very thoughtful way that, again, continues to leverage the strength of the private sector and not alienate them. And so whether it's, we financed the bike share program. It's the first time, any bike share program has been financed by a financial institution and not paid for by the city because the fundamental business works. You just have to engage in complicated public-private partnerships. We're the first people who have ever done a social impact bond where we are paying for social services for our most vulnerable residents because we know that there are things you can do and you can capture those savings on the back end. So it's about taking the creative power of the city and all of its tools and then more comprehensively and in a targeted way saying, I want to make real efforts at addressing these problems and not just thinking they will magically ride the wave of economic growth.
What stands in the way of doing that?
I think it's a combination of leadership, priorities, who's at the table, and you have to really, and in many ways the Bloomberg administration has been amazing because they did the first social impact bond with us, but then continuing to engage with smart public sector people and allowing the city to use their balance sheet in a very creative way to drive those kinds of impacts. And I think that's just a real mind shift, is saying, are we going to take equity? Like maybe the city should be taking equity positions in these deals, right? Don't just take the highest price up front for the land. Take a tail, because if we're right, we're going to create all these amazing long-term impacts and these longer-term job growth. So I think that it's really having smart people who understand how you operate in a really complex financing system right now, but really care fundamentally about all those people that really have not been part of the dialogue. And I think that's really the key.
Betsy, thorniest
Well, I'm sorry, I couldn't really hear you, Alicia.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it wasn't your fault. I think it's the
echo.
The echo, yeah. But I do think one thing that is essential that the new mayor is going to have to think about, people really do go, all people, rich, poor, whatever, they do care that there's safety in the streets, in their homes. They care about the garbage being picked up. They care about the streets and the parks, again, being clean. That's what they really want. And I think it's really important to make sure that the management of the city that's put in place knows how to do that. That, to me, is kind of the number one thing for everybody. That's an equalizer, Eddie. I hope you agree with that. I think there are a lot of other things that have to be looked at very carefully. I do agree with public-private partnerships. I'm a little concerned about taking something like the Central Park Conservancy and taking some of their funds and putting them in other parks. When I was Parks Commissioner, I set up something called the City Parks Foundation, which tried to raise money through the Conservancy, among others, to put money into other parks voluntarily. And it was very successful, by the way. It wasn't quite as successful as the Central Park Conservancy, but it's the richest piece of land in the world. And so I think those are the kinds of things that the mayor needs to look at, and I think the city as a whole will respond to, but I think the first thing is making sure the trains run on time, if you know what I mean.
Greg, it's interesting, Betsy's making a point about livability. The second slide you showed yesterday with the New York ratings compared to other cities, I think you showed the livability rating. New York was 56th.
Yeah.
56th. What needs to happen to drive that rating up? Was that the lowest rating New York had on livability?
New York had the lowest rating of the top 6 cities in the world that I was talking about in that category.
In that category.
Well, let me just answer the first question first, which is, flushed with the success of creating my regional government.
Right.
Yeah, the next thing I
clock's
would...
ticking, buddy.
I would, of course, get that regional government to work on the infrastructure piece and the housing piece. And in particular, I would pursue exactly what Alicia's saying, which is to pursue a different equity model for investing in affordable housing, and particularly for large-scale, small units of affordable housing with a combination of private equity and public finance, just as they've done successfully in Hong Kong and Singapore. So my regional government that I've borrowed from Paris and Tokyo would start to do what Hong Kong and Singapore have done around housing. And then there would be two other things that would be really important to me. One is the school system, and the second one is the immigration system. So my next decree would be to start issuing New York visas, right? And my New York visas would be aimed at talented workers in all sorts of new tech sectors. It would be aimed at teachers that are well trained from overseas. It would be aimed at all sorts of key professionals in the public service. And I would have a specific category within the new US immigration department of New York only visas, and that would be a really key thing I would do. Now, how would that help with the livability problem? The livability problem that New York has from the outside, not the inside in, but the outside in, is that Economist Intelligence Unit ranking that I talked about, firstly measures stability, where New York scores very well. Secondly, it measures health care. Now, you've been through a big national debate about healthcare. The rest of the world does not understand why Americans do not treat healthcare as a public good in the same way that street cleaning or education or firefighting or anything else is treated, right?
True, I forgot.
So the rest of the civilized world loves America but thinks you're mad, right? Healthcare is a public good, should be publicly provided. New York scores down on healthcare. Culture and environment, New York scores well. Disaster recovery capability has been enhanced by Katrina, actually, in terms of New York scores. The next two things are education and infrastructure. And if you followed what I said yesterday on both education, particularly public education, where there is too much of a corollary between income and attainment. Yeah? Rich kids score well, poor kids score less well. That is not acceptable in the rest of the world. And The Economist marks New York down from that point of view. And infrastructure, all the regional problems of infrastructure that we talked about yesterday and your colleagues have mentioned here, New York scores down on those. So you would have to fix healthcare, education, and infrastructure for New York to start to score very highly on those rankings.
Okay.
And you'd need a regional government, of course, to do it.
I don't think you need a new visa. I think you need a new country. I mean, why are we even going
That's
to
right.
Let's just let's secede.
I want to talk a minute about resilience and pick up on the themes that Dr. Roden and Rip both brought to our attention. And Dr. Roden said it's not, the question is not if, but how. So how will New York respond to what she pointed out is the next severe climate event? Thoughts on that? Betsy?
I think you have to look at what worked during the last one, which was Sandy, and I think what really worked in New York were the community organizations that were actually already existing in places like Red Hook. But what happened in the Rockaways with that wonderful, the Rockaway Surf Club, where everybody thought there were a bunch of hippies coming in to ruin our neighborhood. And these young people, and they were young people, is my understanding, set up the most extraordinary community organization, which did everything from helping individuals in their homes in some of the worst places to doing food soup kitchens and just making it better for people in the community. So I think we need to look at those things that worked. I think the other things, of course, are important. The fixing the barricades and the dune things. Then that's all going to cost money, and that's an infrastructure project that needs to be done. But what can be done very quickly is to build up those community organizations, to help them, to encourage them. And you're absolutely right about healthcare. I completely forgot it and what people care about. It is simply, I do agree, the most important thing. And by the way, the people in the surf club provided healthcare for the community in the Rockaways. So that's what I would focus on.
I want to just hold this thought on resilience a minute and just compare these two scales of responses, because Greg, you called for regional government, and you're calling for investment in organizations that are very, very close to the ground. How do you reconcile working at both of those scales simultaneously? It's hard, Greg, I think, here to make the case that bigger government is better government, which essentially regional government is bigger government, government that is farther away from the people. I want to just address that quickly.
Let me give you a very
come
quick
back to
answer and say that
resilience.
I think that what globalization has done is to change the important scales of action so that most of the government we have is too big for the small things and too small for the big things. So the challenge, now I don't expect you to create a regional government here tomorrow, but I do think that you could consolidate a lot of activities that are done at the regional level into one more capable organization. You could have less government and have better government. And if I were starting, I'd start with the MTA, the Port Authority, and the RPA. I'd put them together, and I would start to build a regional platform for the New York region around transport and infrastructure, and I would link that with planning and housing and try to consolidate, not to create more government, but to consolidate. And I completely accept that that is compatible with also working much more at the district level, which I think you need to do. So I would say that's how you do it.
Okay, all right. And then just circling back to the resilience question, other thoughts on that response that New York, put your mayor's hat back on, that you would make to that
Yeah,
question?
and it actually, it really connects to both Betsy and Greg's comments. I mean, you know, resilience happens across multiple scales and needs to happen in a coordinated manner across multiple scales. And there's not a preferable scale for resilience building. You know, it can only happen on the city or regional scale, issues of large-scale infrastructure. You know, infrastructure investment, this is actually the perfect time for infrastructure investment because we have to invest in resilience building. So this is the perfect time to, one, strengthen our infrastructure, two, create more jobs, and then three, resilience happens on a neighborhood scale. I mean, basically, the idea of small-scale resilience is actually hugely important, and that's not necessarily where city government is going to be best equipped, but coordination and support for community-based organizations is perfect on a neighborhood scale.
Yeah. Eddie, it's the second time you've mentioned jobs, so I want to ask you, what do you think a mayor can do about job creation?
Well, I mean, the mayor has a real bully pulpit in terms of making sure that the private sector's needs are met and also making sure that the residents' needs are met. This is a great opportunity to look at all of those private sector actors, and there are plenty of them who are serious about the issue of skill development and are serious about the issue of developing a talent pipeline, and coordinate them with those people who are very serious about making sure that our most vulnerable are taken care of. This is a great opportunity for coordination. There's good work being done, but this is a great opportunity to enhance that work and build it up.
So invest more?
Invest more and coordinate better.
Oh, Alicia, I wanted to come back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess on the resiliency question, I would just say again that this is an unbelievable opportunity, you know, in the midst of a disaster where there's huge amounts of federal money that's being flooded into various layers of government here to do infrastructure and resiliency or recovery work. And again, I think the challenge will be how do you centralize those resources in a way that you can best leverage private capital so that you can get more bang for your buck. And I think, again, in my own experience, you know, on one hand, you have to talk to the Department of Environmental Protection, then you have to go talk to EDC. And I think that, again, that inability to bring those agencies together from a resource and structuring point of view ultimately allows more money to leak out of the system. And that's just a tragedy because there's a lot of work that needs to get done. So again, I think that centralization and public sector investment professionals who have the resources all at their disposal are critical to both large-scale infrastructure projects, but also an important project like the one that we've been working on for years out in Arvern, where you need to deal with multiple agencies, and it's an unbelievable opportunity to actually build new infrastructure that is resilient and an incredible mixed-income community with the right kind of retail and schools. And for the first time, there's all this money that's out there to do it, and the problem is figuring out how to capture it and coordinate it in a development plan.
How do you capture it?
I think that you have to have a little bit of less turf wars, and whether that's a question of, again, creating a super agency, which is a redevelopment and real estate entity, that's where you go, and you are a developer, or you are a community, and you are looking to finance an array of uses in a project. And you can go and have that conversation with one set of people.
Can you imagine having that at the regional level?
Well, I think, again, in real life, the jurisdictional issues are quite complex, but I think certainly for mass transit and large-scale infrastructure projects, which literally cross jurisdictional lines, I think he's absolutely right. But I think for whether you're going to be building the new soccer stadium in the Bronx or whether you're going to be creating a mixed-income community in the Rockaways, those are things that are New York City jurisdictional issues and need to be streamlined, and there has to be a way to interact with both the development community and the financing community, particularly in our interest rate environment, to be leveraging more capital and taking more thoughtful approaches to how we're investing in these real assets. It's just a wasted opportunity.
Betsy, you wanted to jump in.
Well, I just think there's another wonderful example. I agree about what could be in Auburn. I despair, by the way, that you're ever going to get a regional agreement from some of the governors. Please, just look at what's happened. But I think if you look, for example, in Brooklyn at the development of the arena and all the housing that's going up around there, and people keep saying there's no housing, it hasn't gone up. Excuse me, it has gone up, it's going up, and it's going up as affordable housing in many, many of the areas, and it's what do you call it? It's prefab housing that's being made in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. This is just an example of the kind of thing that really does work. The project has subsidies, yes, but it's employing hundreds and hundreds of people in that area in Brooklyn, which was very, very depressed. And just to see it, it's an example of the kind of thing that can work when you have a developer who's very forward-thinking, you have very creative government out there that was helpful, but you always have those that are the naysayers, and they're still saying it isn't a good project. Well, I beg anybody to go out there and see it and say it isn't a good project. So that's the kind of development that gives jobs, works on sustainability. These block apartments are really quite extraordinary. One is going up right now. Prefabs, they're prefabricated apartments made in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And they're quite extraordinary. This is going to solve, I think, a lot of problems.
We have less than a minute left. In fact, less than half a minute left. So quickly, 50 years from now, what do you want to be remembered for, Mr. Mayor?
I think New York needs to take its place again as the most innovative city in the world, and it can do that by aligning with all the philanthropies we heard from earlier and the UN to build its innovation story, because the citizen story, the business story, and the visitor story is pretty good.
It looks like you are the only one who can answer that question. We're out of time. Thanks very much. Help me thank our panel.